The rain arrives just before dawn, moving across the Tiber in sheets, drumming against terracotta tiles that have absorbed Roman weather for half a millennium. Water streams down the ochre facades of the Apostolic Palace, tracing the mortar lines between stones quarried from hillsides now forgotten, carried by hands whose names were never recorded. Inside, in corridors lit only by the first gray light filtering through windows taller than most houses, the palace breathes in that particular silence that belongs to structures too large for their current purpose. The beauty is undeniable. Raphael's brushstrokes still glow on plaster walls. Gilt moldings catch even this pale morning luminescence. Marble floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps reflect the vaulted ceilings above. But beneath this beauty, in windowless basements extending 3 levels below the courtyards, generators hum. Pumps push water through miles of copper piping. Electrical panels mounted in medieval stone alcoves feed power to lights, elevators, climate control systems that work ceaselessly to prevent the very humidity now sliding down the windows from destroying everything inside. The visible palace tells one story, the invisible infrastructure tells another. This is the truth of all monuments that survive beyond their founding generation. Beauty is only the surface. Beneath it lies a machine of maintenance, a web of dependencies, a system of labor that never stops. The Apostolic Palace was built to manifest divine authority in stone and paint, but it endures only through profoundly human effort, through decisions made in moments of crisis, through compromises that trade purity for survival. The question is not whether the palace is magnificent. The question is who paid for this magnificence, in what currency, and whether the cost can ever be fully calculated. The palace does not occupy space so much as it dominates topography. Rising from the Vatican Hill, it sprawls across more than 160,000 square meters of constructed area, not counting the gardens that stretch westward like a green cushion between sacred architecture and the modern city. The numbers accumulate slowly, each one adding weight to the impossibility of the project. 12,000 rooms, 50 staircases, 20 courtyards, more than 20 chapels embedded within the structure, some large enough to hold hundreds, others intimate enough for private devotion. The Sistine Chapel, the most famous room in Christendom, measures just over 40 meters in length and 13 in width, yet its ceiling required 4 years of a single man's life, working on scaffolding, paint dripping into his eyes, his spine curved backward day after day. And the Sistine is merely one room among thousands. To walk the palace is to move through a city built vertically and horizontally simultaneously. Corridors extend for hundreds of meters without interruption, their walls lined with marble pilasters, their ceilings coffered and painted with scenes of theological triumph. The Scala Regia, designed by Bernini, climbs from the entrance portico to the Sala Regia through a forced perspective that makes the ascent seem both longer and more dramatic than its actual 30 meters. Light falls from windows positioned to illuminate specific moments in the climb, washing over white marble that seems to glow from within. This is architecture as theater, space designed not for comfort or efficiency, but for psychological impact. A visiting ambassador, a petitioning prince, a humble pilgrim granted audience. Each would climb these stairs feeling progressively smaller, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space, their eyes drawn upward toward the palace's interior, toward the seat of papal authority that awaited at the summit. But beyond the ceremonial routes lie the service corridors, the narrow passages that connect kitchen to dining hall, chapel to sacristy, bedroom to bathroom. These spaces are plain, their walls bare plaster or exposed brick, their ceilings low enough to trap heat in summer and cold in winter. Here, the hierarchy becomes visible in architectural form. The grand apartments were built for display. The service passages were built for function. And between them, embedded in the very structure, is the assumption that some people exist to be seen and others to remain invisible, that beauty for the few requires labor from the many. The palace, as it stands today, is not the product of a single vision, but an accumulation of ambitions layered across 2.5 centuries of nearly continuous construction. Pope Nicholas V, in the mid-15th century, first conceived of transforming the medieval papal residence into something befitting the Church's claim to spiritual supremacy. He saw Rome emerging from centuries of neglect, its ancient monuments crumbling, its population reduced to a fraction of its imperial peak. Nicholas believed that Christianity deserved architecture as magnificent as pagan Rome had produced. More than that, he believed such architecture was necessary, that faith needed visible proof of its power. He wrote that the common people, unable to grasp theological arguments through reason alone, required monumental buildings to strengthen their belief. Grandeur, in this view, was not vanity but pedagogy. Beauty was a tool of conviction. Nicholas died before his vision could advance far, but the idea took root. Pope Sixtus IV commissioned the chapel that bears his name, bringing to Rome the greatest painters of the age, Botticelli, Perugino, Ghirlandaio, to cover its walls with frescoes depicting the lives of Moses and Christ. Sixtus understood spectacle. He understood that Rome's claim to preeminence among Christian cities required not just spiritual authority, but cultural supremacy. The artists he hired were expensive, their demands often difficult, their schedules unpredictable. But their work transformed a simple rectangular chapel into a statement of papal power, a demonstration that Rome could compete with Florence, with Venice, with any city in Italy for artistic prestige. Then came Julius II, a pope who embodied the contradictions of the Renaissance Church with almost theatrical intensity. Giuliano della Rovere was a warrior before he was a pontiff, a man more comfortable in armor than vestments, more inclined to settle disputes with armies than with diplomacy. He took the name Julius consciously, invoking the memory of Julius Caesar, signaling his intention to restore Rome to its ancient glory. Julius was not a spiritual mystic. He was a builder, a patron, a man who believed that the Church's authority rested on its ability to command respect, fear, and awe in equal measure. Julius looked at the medieval Vatican and saw inadequacy. The old St. Peter's Basilica, more than 1,000 years old, was collapsing in sections, its roof leaking, its walls cracked. The papal apartments, though expanded by his predecessors, still bore the marks of their medieval origins. Cramped rooms, dark corridors, defensive architecture designed for a time when popes were besieged by rival Roman families. Julius wanted something greater. He wanted a basilica that would dwarf every church in Christendom. He wanted apartments that would rival the palaces of kings, and he was willing to bankrupt the papacy to achieve it. In 1506, Julius laid the foundation stone for the new St. Peter's, commissioning Donato Bramante to design a structure of unprecedented scale. Bramante proposed a centralized plan, a massive dome rising above a Greek cross, architecture that would embody divine perfection through geometric harmony. The estimated cost was staggering. The timeline was measured in generations. Julius did not care. He also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, overruling the artist's protests that he was a sculptor, not a painter. Michelangelo resisted, argued, eventually submitted. The result consumed 4 years of his life and created one of the supreme achievements of Western art. But the cost to Michelangelo was profound. His letters from this period describe physical agony, creative despair, isolation. He wrote poetry mocking his own suffering, describing paint dripping onto his face. his body bent like a Syrian bow, his vision distorted from staring upward for hours each day. Julius understood what he was demanding. He simply believed the outcome justified the sacrifice. This is the first lesson in the palace's true cost. Beauty of this magnitude requires someone to pay with their body, their time, their health. The frescoes that tourists photograph today, that art historians analyze, that believers contemplate, each one represents days of labor under conditions that would violate modern safety standards, performed by individuals who had little choice but to accept the commission or face financial ruin. The construction process itself was an exercise in logistics that strained the capabilities of Renaissance technology. The marble came from Carrara, transported by ship down the Italian coast, then up the Tiber on barges, then hauled by oxen and human muscle up the Vatican Hill. Each block weighed hundreds of kilograms. Some of the massive columns incorporated into the palace's facades weighed several tons. Moving them required specialized equipment, cranes powered by tread wheels, sledges pulled by teams of animals, rope and tackle systems that distributed weight across multiple anchor points. Accidents were common. Men fell from scaffolding. Ropes snapped under load. Stones shifted during transport, crushing whoever stood in the wrong place. The skilled craftsmen, the stonemasons who cut and dressed the marble, the plasterers who prepared walls for fresco, the carpenters who built the scaffolding and roof trusses. These men were relatively well compensated. They belonged to guilds that regulated their trade, protected their interests, ensured a degree of quality control. But beneath them labored an army of unskilled workers, men who carried materials, mixed mortar, dug foundations, hauled away rubble. These laborers were paid by the day, their wages barely sufficient for food and shelter. Their employment depended on weather and the availability of funds. When money ran short, they were dismissed. When work resumed, they returned because there were few alternatives. The palace under construction was a city within a city, a sprawling worksite that operated year-round, pausing only for the most severe weather or the most important feast days. At the peak of activity, under Julius II and his immediate successors, hundreds of men worked simultaneously on different sections of the complex. Bramante's new St. Peter's required demolishing much of the old basilica, a process that horrified traditionalists who saw ancient mosaics and venerated altars torn down to make way for modern architecture. The papal apartments expanded westward and upward, adding floor after floor, room after room, each one requiring foundation work that descended into the soft volcanic tufa beneath the Vatican Hill, requiring walls thick enough to support the weight of marble and fresco above. Financing this enterprise became Julius's obsession and his crisis. The papacy's revenue came from multiple sources, none of them sufficient for the scale of construction Julius demanded. Tithes flowed in from dioceses across Europe, but much of this income was already committed to maintaining the Church's administrative apparatus, funding its diplomatic missions, supporting its charitable obligations. Julius expanded the sale of indulgences, spiritual certificates that promised reduction of time in purgatory in exchange for monetary contributions. The practice was not new, but Julius systematized it, turning it into a revenue stream significant enough to fund construction. Indulgent sales were marketed across Europe, with portions of the proceeds designated specifically for the building fund. This decision would have consequences far beyond Julius's lifetime, planting seeds of resentment that would eventually fracture Western Christianity. But in the early 16th century, it seemed a pragmatic solution to a practical problem. Julius also borrowed extensively, using Italian banking houses, particularly the Fuggers of Augsburg, to advance funds against future income. These loans carried interest, of course, adding to the papacy's long-term financial burden, but they allowed construction to continue when current revenues fell short. The bankers were not philanthropists. They demanded collateral, secured their loans against papal properties and revenues, inserted themselves into the Vatican's financial operations with a degree of control that limited the Pope's fiscal independence. This, too, would become a pattern. Great projects funded by debt that constrained future choices, that turned patrons into debtors, that made institutions dependent on the very financiers they claimed to regulate. The spiritual justification for this expenditure was articulated repeatedly by Julius and his defenders. Rome was the center of Christendom. The Pope was Christ's vicar on earth. The physical setting of papal authority must reflect its theological significance. To build modestly would be to suggest humility where grandeur was required, to imply doubt where certainty must reign. This logic was coherent within its own framework, but it also revealed a fundamental tension at the heart of the Church's self-conception: how to reconcile the teachings of a carpenter from Galilee who preached poverty and humility with an institution that commissioned palaces rivaling those of emperors. Julius died in 1513, before St. Peter's progressed beyond its foundations, before Michelangelo completed the Sistine ceiling's full program. His successors inherited both his vision and his debts. Pope Leo VIII, Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, continued the construction with enthusiasm but little fiscal discipline. Leo loved art, music, theater, spectacle. He spent lavishly, not just on building, but on his own court, maintaining a retinue of hundreds, hosting banquets and performances, commissioning works from Raphael and other masters. Leo famously remarked upon his election, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." This attitude defined his reign. He expanded indulgence sales further, dispatching preachers across Europe to raise funds. One of these preachers, Johann Tetzel, became notorious for his aggressive marketing, allegedly claiming that, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. This commercialization of spiritual benefits provoked Martin Luther's protest in 1517. Luther's 95 Theses, nailed to the door of the Wittenberg Church, were initially a theological argument about the nature of repentance and the authority of the Pope to remit penalties for sin. But they resonated because they articulated a widespread resentment about money flowing from Germany to Rome, about Italian palaces built with Northern Europe's wealth, about a church that seemed more concerned with architectural grandeur than with the salvation it claimed to serve. The Protestant Reformation was not caused solely by indulgence sales or by Vatican construction projects, but these issues became focal points for broader dissatisfaction, symbols of an institution that had lost its way. The Reformation fractured Christendom and devastated papal revenues. Entire regions, Scandinavia, much of Germany, England, Scotland, left the Catholic Church, taking with them the tithes and taxes that had funded Rome's projects. The papacy suddenly faced a crisis of income precisely when its commitments were greatest. Construction slowed, but could not stop entirely. Partly built structures required maintenance to prevent decay. Craftsmen under contract demanded payment. Debts to bankers came due regardless of revenue shortfalls. Pope Paul III, who reigned from 1534 to 1549, navigated this crisis through a combination of austerity and strategic investment. Paul slowed construction on St. Peter's, reducing the workforce, limiting expenditures to essential structural work. But he also understood that abandoning the project would signal defeat, would suggest the Church lacked the resources and will to complete what it had started. So construction continued, just slowly enough to remain financially sustainable. Paul also convened the Council of Trent, initiating the Catholic Counter-Reformation, a comprehensive effort to reform church practices, clarify doctrine, and reassert papal authority. The Council's decrees eventually transformed Catholic worship and administration, but they also reaffirmed the importance of visual splendor in religious practice, endorsing elaborate church decoration as a means of inspiring devotion and distinguishing Catholicism from Protestant austerity. This decision ensured that the palace's expansion would continue, that successive popes would add their own apartments, chapels, libraries, and museums. Pope Sixtus V, elected in 1585, was particularly ambitious. Sixtus was a Franciscan, theoretically committed to poverty, but as pope, he pursued a building program that rivaled Julius II's. He completed the Dome of St. Peter's, finally giving Michelangelo's design its crowning element. He reorganized the Vatican's internal layout, constructing the library building that still bears his name, a vast hall stretching more than 70 meters, its barrel-vaulted ceiling painted with scenes celebrating Catholic learning and triumph. Sixtus also improved Rome's infrastructure, constructing aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city, straightening streets, erecting obelisks at key intersections to serve as landmarks and symbols of papal power. Sixtus financed these projects through aggressive taxation, through selling offices within the church's bureaucracy, through confiscating properties of those accused of crimes, real or invented. His methods were brutal at times, his enforcement harsh, but they worked. Revenue flowed into the papal treasury, construction advanced, and Rome began to resemble the Baroque capital it would become. Sixtus reigned for only 5 years, dying in 1590, but his impact on the Vatican's physical form was profound. He transformed the palace from a collection of connected buildings into an integrated complex, establishing circulation patterns, defining courtyards, creating the spatial relationships that still organize the structure today. The 17th century brought the Baroque aesthetic to its fullest expression in the Vatican. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the era's supreme architect and sculptor, reshaped the palace's relationship with St. Peter's, designing the Scala Regia to link the basilica with the papal apartments, creating a monumental entrance that announced the Pope's authority to everyone who approached. Bernini's work was theatrical, dramatic, designed to evoke emotional responses: awe, wonder, submission. He understood that architecture could manipulate perception, that proportions and lighting could make spaces feel larger or smaller, grander or more intimate. The Scala Regia uses diminishing column spacing and a narrowing width to create an illusion of greater length, making the climb feel more significant than its actual dimensions would suggest. But Baroque grandeur required resources on a scale that strained even the papacy's capacity. The materials alone, the colored marbles, the bronze, the gold leaf, the massive timbers for roof structures, cost fortunes. Bernini's projects often exceeded their budgets by multiples, forcing popes to find additional funding midstream or risk leaving works unfinished. The labor requirements were equally demanding. Specialized craftsmen, stuccoists who could create the elaborate plasterwork that characterizes Baroque interiors, bronze founders capable of casting massive statues and architectural elements, gilders who applied gold leaf to surfaces with microscopic precision. These artisans commanded high wages and could dictate terms because their skills were scarce. Beneath this specialized labor continued the work of ordinary maintenance, unglamorous but essential. The palace's roofs, covering acres of building, required constant repair. Roman weather, wet winters, hot summers, occasional violent storms, aged materials quickly. Lead sheeting, used to waterproof valleys and flashings, degraded and needed replacement. Terracotta tiles cracked and slipped. Timber roof trusses, exposed to temperature fluctuations and humidity, dried out, shrank, developed cracks that compromised structural integrity. Teams of roofers worked year-round, inspecting, patching, replacing. Their work was dangerous. The palace's roofs rise steeply in places, their surfaces slippery when wet. Falls were common. Injuries frequently ended careers, leaving workers unable to earn wages, dependent on charity or family support. Inside the palace, other systems demanded attention. The heating infrastructure, primitive by modern standards but sophisticated for its time, relied on fireplaces in each major room. This meant that servants had to carry firewood up staircases, through corridors, distributing fuel to dozens of locations daily during winter. They had to lay fires, light them, tend them, remove ashes. The amount of wood consumed each winter was staggering, requiring contracts with suppliers who harvested forests outside Rome, transported logs to the city, cut them to appropriate sizes. The cost appeared in the papal accounts as a recurring expense, thousands of scudi annually, increasing each time the palace expanded, each time another apartment was added, another chapel constructed. Water presented even greater challenges. Rome's ancient aqueducts, built by engineers whose skills had been lost for centuries, brought water from distant springs into the city. But getting that water from public fountains to the Vatican Hill, then distributing it throughout the palace, required infrastructure that evolved slowly across generations. Initially, servants carried water in buckets, an exhausting process that limited how much could be used for cleaning, cooking, personal hygiene. Gradually, as engineering knowledge revived, aqueduct branches extended to the Vatican, feeding fountains in the courtyards. From these fountains, water could be bucketed more efficiently. But it was not until the late 16th century that internal piping began to distribute water directly to kitchens and selected apartments, and even then the system was limited, serving only the most important spaces. Sanitation was equally problematic. Chamber pots were emptied into cesspits or carried down to disposal areas. The smell, in summer especially, must have been pervasive despite the perfumes and incense used to mask it. Disease spread easily in such conditions. Plague struck Rome periodically, forcing the papal court to flee to healthier locations, leaving the palace partially empty, its construction projects suspended. Each epidemic reminded the residents that grandeur offered no protection from biological reality, that marble and fresco could not prevent infection, that power had limits. The palace's staff numbered in the hundreds, organized into a strict hierarchy that mirrored the church's broader structure. At the top were the prelates, the cardinals and bishops, who served as papal advisors, diplomats, administrators. These men lived in apartments within the palace or in nearby buildings, their positions conferring status and income. Below them were the clerics who managed specific functions, the masters of ceremonies who orchestrated liturgical events, the librarians who oversaw the growing collections of manuscripts and books, the secretaries who maintained correspondence and records. These positions required education, offered security, provided pathways to advancement within the church hierarchy. But the majority of the staff occupied positions far less exalted. Cooks, cleaners, launderers, porters, gardeners, stablemen. These workers kept the palace functioning day to day. They rose before dawn, worked until after dark, lived in cramped quarters in the palace's attics or in buildings outside the walls. Their wages were minimal, often paid months in arrears when papal finances were tight. Many supplemented their income through tips from visitors, through selling access to restricted areas, through petty corruption that was tacitly tolerated because everyone understood that official wages alone were insufficient. Women worked in the palace too, though their presence was carefully regulated and their numbers limited. Laundresses washed the vast quantities of linen required: altar cloths, vestments, table linens, bed sheets. This work was grueling, involving heating water, scrubbing fabric by hand, wringing it out, hanging it to dry, ironing it with heated irons. The laundresses worked in dedicated rooms, often in basements where water could be more easily managed, where the humidity and heat of their work would not damage the palace's decorated interiors. They were paid even less than male servants, their labor considered unskilled despite the strength and endurance it required. The palace also employed guards, initially drawn from Italian noble families, later increasingly recruited from Switzerland. The Swiss Guard, established in the early 16th century, became the Vatican's primary security force, responsible for protecting the Pope, controlling access to the palace, maintaining order during ceremonies. The guards were mercenaries, paid soldiers who signed contracts committing them to the Vatican service. Their wages were higher than ordinary servants, but still modest, and the risk was real. When Rome was sacked in 1527 by imperial troops, Swiss guards died defending Pope Clement VII's escape route, buying time with their lives while the Pope fled through a covered passageway to the Castel San Angelo. That sack of Rome was a catastrophe that revealed the fragility of papal power. Mutinous troops, unpaid and hungry, rampaged through the city for months, looting, burning, killing. The Vatican was pillaged, manuscripts were destroyed, artworks were damaged or stolen. The palace itself was vandalized, its rooms occupied by soldiers who cared nothing for their historical or spiritual significance. Clement VII survived but was humiliated, forced to pay an enormous ransom, compelled to watch helplessly as his capital was ravaged. The sack demonstrated that all the palace's grandeur, all its artistic treasures, all its theological symbolism meant nothing when faced with military force motivated by grievance and greed. Recovery from the sack took years and required financial sacrifices that limited construction for a generation. But the palace endured. Gradually, order was restored, repairs were made, the routines of papal administration resumed. This resilience became a pattern. The palace survived because it was too important to abandon, because too much had been invested to simply walk away. But survival required constant negotiation between ambition and resource, between the desire to expand and the need to maintain what already existed. The 17th and 18th centuries saw continued elaboration of the palace's interiors. Successive popes added their own marks, new apartments, new chapels, new galleries to house growing art collections. The Vatican museums trace their origins to this period, beginning with Pope Julius II's decision to display his collection of classical sculpture in the Belvedere courtyard. Later, popes expanded these collections, acquiring artworks, commissioning new pieces, arranging them in galleries that became destinations for scholars and artists, seeking to study the masterworks of antiquity and the Renaissance. But as the collections grew, so did the costs of maintaining them. Paintings required stable temperature and humidity to prevent deterioration. Sculptures needed protection from pollution and physical damage. The palace's infrastructure, designed for a residential and administrative complex, struggled to accommodate these new functions. Galleries were retrofitted into spaces designed for other purposes. Climate control was primitive, relying on thick walls and limited windows to moderate temperature swings. Conservation was rudimentary, often limited to dusting and occasional cleaning with methods that sometimes damaged the very works they aimed to preserve. The 18th century brought new challenges. Enlightenment thought questioned the Church's intellectual authority. Political changes shifted power away from traditional aristocracies that had supported papal interests. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars disrupted the European order that had sustained the papacy for centuries. In 1798, French troops occupied Rome, establishing a republic and forcing Pope Pius VI into exile. The Vatican was looted, its treasures shipped to Paris. The palace itself was taken over, its rooms used for republican administration. Pius VI died in captivity in France, a pope without a throne, stripped of temporal power. His successor, Pius VII, eventually returned to Rome after Napoleon's defeat, but the papacy's position was fundamentally weakened. The Congress of Vienna restored the papal states, but they were anachronistic, medieval territorial holdings in an age of nation-states. The palace remained the Pope's residence, but it was no longer the seat of a major European power. It was the headquarters of a religious institution struggling to maintain relevance in a secularizing world. The 19th century brought further losses. Italian unification, driven by nationalist sentiment and Sardinian military power, gradually absorbed the Papal States. In 1870, Italian troops entered Rome, completing the unification of Italy. Pope Pius IX retreated to the Vatican, declaring himself a prisoner and refusing to recognize the Italian state's legitimacy. The palace became the Pope's refuge, its walls a boundary that Italian troops respected, but that offered no real security, only the protection of international opinion. This period forced a dramatic rethinking of the Vatican's finances. Without the Papal State's revenues, the papacy's income collapsed. The Italian state seized church properties, nationalized institutions that had provided funding. The Vatican was left with the palace, St. Peter's, and the immediate surrounding buildings, but no territory, no tax base, no sources of revenue beyond voluntary contributions from Catholics worldwide. This crisis, as devastating as it felt to those who lived through it, ultimately forced innovations that would prove essential to the palace's long-term survival. Faced with financial ruin, the Vatican began to professionalize its administration. Instead of relying on aristocratic prelates who managed finances as a sideline to their ceremonial duties, the papacy hired trained accountants, established budgets, tracked expenditures. The palace's staffing was reduced, unnecessary positions were eliminated, work routines were scrutinized for efficiency. It was a painful process, resisted by those whose livelihoods depended on traditional arrangements, but it was necessary. The Vatican also began to open itself cautiously to visitors. The museums, previously accessible only to scholars with special permission, began admitting the general public for a fee. The revenue was modest initially, but it grew as tourism increased, as more people gained the means to travel, as guidebooks and improved transportation made Rome accessible to middle-class visitors. The palace itself remained largely closed, the Pope's residence and the Church's administrative headquarters, but the museums became a significant attraction, drawing visitors who paid entrance fees that funded ongoing operations. The 20th century brought further transformations. The Lateran Treaty of 1929, negotiated between Pope Pius V and Benito Mussolini, established Vatican City as an independent sovereign state. The territory was tiny, less than half a square kilometer, but sovereignty brought legal protections and a framework for managing the Vatican's affairs. The treaty also included a financial settlement compensating the papacy for the loss of the Papal States. This money, carefully invested, provided income that reduced the Vatican's dependence on contributions. The Second World War tested the Vatican's neutrality and the palace's physical integrity. Rome was bombed, though the Vatican itself was spared direct hits. The palace sheltered refugees, Jews fleeing persecution, Allied prisoners of war who escaped and sought sanctuary. Food supplies ran short, heating fuel was unavailable. The palace, designed for grandeur, proved difficult to maintain under wartime austerity. Staff wore coats indoors during winter. Meals became simple, portions small. The contrast between the frescoed ceilings and the cold, hungry people moving beneath them illustrated a fundamental truth. Magnificence cannot keep anyone warm. After the war, tourism resumed and expanded dramatically. Italy's post-war recovery, the growth of commercial aviation, rising prosperity in North America and Western Europe, all contributed to an explosion in visitors. The Vatican museums, which had attracted tens of thousands annually before the war, began drawing hundreds of thousands, then millions. This created revenue, but also challenges. The palace's infrastructure, already stressed, faced unprecedented demands. Bathrooms designed for a few dozen daily users now served thousands. Electrical systems installed in the early 20th century struggled to power modern lighting and climate control. Floors worn smooth over centuries now endured traffic that accelerated deterioration. Conservation became urgent. By the mid-20th century, many of the palace's frescoes showed signs of serious damage. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling was darkened by centuries of candle smoke, grime, and poorly conceived restoration attempts. Raphael's stanza needed cleaning and structural stabilization. The Vatican faced a choice: invest enormous sums in conservation or watch masterpieces deteriorate beyond recovery. The decision to restore the Sistine Chapel ceiling, begun in 1980 and continuing for more than a decade, illustrated the complexity and cost of modern conservation. The project required teams of specialists, art historians, chemists, structural engineers, conservators, trained in Renaissance fresco techniques. Scaffolding was erected that allowed workers to access the ceiling safely while minimizing stress on the structure. The cleaning process was painstaking, involving chemical analysis to determine which substances were original paint and which were later accretions, then carefully removing the contaminants without damaging the underlying work. The results were stunning but controversial. Colors emerged that had been hidden for centuries, so vivid that some scholars initially questioned whether the restoration had gone too far, whether the vibrant hues were authentic or enhanced. The cost of the Sistine restoration alone exceeded $20 million, funded partly by Vatican resources, partly by a controversial arrangement with Japanese television networks that gained exclusive filming rights in exchange for financial support. This deal provoked criticism. Some argued the Vatican was selling access to sacred art, commercializing what should remain beyond market transactions. But the alternative was to let the ceiling continue deteriorating, risking permanent loss. The compromise reflected a reality that institutions preserving cultural heritage face constantly. Ideals confront financial limits, and purity often loses to pragmatism. Today, the Apostolic Palace operates as a hybrid entity, part residence, part museum, part administrative complex. The Pope lives in a relatively modest apartment, not in the grand papal chambers of previous centuries. Those historic rooms are preserved but largely empty, maintained for their historical value but no longer inhabited. The modern papacy has embraced, at least rhetorically, a simpler style, a recognition that the Church's credibility in an age of global poverty depends partly on the example its leaders set. Yet the palace remains expensive to maintain. The annual operating budget runs to tens of millions of euros. Electricity costs alone are staggering. The palace and museums consume power constantly, running climate control systems that protect artworks, operating elevators and escalators for the millions of annual visitors, powering modern offices where the Church's global administration functions. Heating in winter, cooling in summer, both necessary to prevent damage to centuries-old materials, both voraciously expensive. Water consumption is another significant cost. The museum's bathrooms, the staff cafeterias, the cleaning required to maintain public spaces that host 15,000 visitors on busy days, all consume water that must be purchased, heated, distributed through aging pipes that periodically leak and require repair. The palace's plumbing is a palimpsest of technologies layered across centuries. Modern PVC pipes run alongside lead conduits installed in the 17th century. Valves and junctions connect systems installed decades apart. Maintaining this hybrid infrastructure requires plumbers who understand both historical materials and contemporary techniques, specialists who are expensive to employ and difficult to replace when they retire. The staffing reflects similar complexities. The Vatican employs roughly 2,000 people across all its operations, many of them working in the palace and museums. Curators, guards, ticket sellers, cleaners, maintenance workers, electricians, carpenters, conservators. Each role is essential. Each represents recurring cost. Salaries are modest by Italian standards, but still significant in aggregate. Benefits, pensions, health insurance. The Vatican, as an employer, bears these obligations like any other institution. And unlike corporations that can relocate or restructure, the Vatican cannot move operations elsewhere. The palace is where it is. The costs are what they are. Security has become increasingly expensive and complex. Terrorism, theft, vandalism, all pose threats that require sophisticated responses. Metal detectors, X-ray machines, trained guards, surveillance cameras monitored continuously. These measures are necessary but costly. After a mentally disturbed visitor attacked Michelangelo's Pietà in 1972, striking the sculpture with a hammer and breaking the Virgin's nose, the Vatican installed protective glass. Similar barriers now protect many of the museum's most valuable pieces. These interventions preserve the art, but change the viewer's experience, adding distance, reducing intimacy. Yet the alternative, risking irreplaceable works, is unacceptable. The palace also faces environmental challenges that previous generations never anticipated. Climate change is altering temperature and humidity patterns in Rome, creating conditions that accelerate deterioration. More intense summer heat waves stress climate control systems, increase cooling costs, make conservation more difficult. Heavier winter rains increase humidity, promoting mold growth in poorly ventilated spaces. The marble facades, exposed to pollution from modern traffic, deteriorate faster than they did in previous centuries when Rome's air was cleaner. Addressing these challenges requires continuous investment in building systems, in conservation efforts, in research to develop new preservation methods. The Vatican has established partnerships with universities, with scientific institutions, with other museums facing similar challenges. Knowledge is shared, techniques are refined, innovations are tested. But this collaboration, valuable as it is, requires staff time, expertise, funding. The cost of preserving the palace is not static. It grows as threats multiply, as standards evolve, as understanding deepens about what materials need and how degradation proceeds. Tourism provides the majority of the revenue that sustains these efforts. The Vatican museums collected approximately €91 million in ticket sales in 2019, before the pandemic. This income is essential. Without it, the conservation work would halt, maintenance would be deferred, the palace would begin a slow decline into decay. But tourism creates its own problems. Millions of footsteps wear down floors. The carbon dioxide exhaled by crowds degrades frescoes. The humidity from breath and bodies alters the environment in enclosed spaces. The Sistine Chapel, at peak times, holds more than 2,000 people simultaneously, far exceeding the capacity the conservators recommend. The Vatican limits entry periods, rotates visitor flows, but the economic pressure to admit as many paying visitors as possible conflicts with the conservation imperative to minimize exposure. The pandemic of 2020 illustrated the fragility of this tourism-dependent model. When lockdowns closed the museums, revenue collapsed. The Vatican faced projections of losses exceeding €100 million. Staff were furloughed, projects were suspended. The silence that descended over the palace, the empty galleries that once teemed with visitors, revealed how thoroughly the institution had come to depend on mass tourism. The frescoes, of course, cared nothing for the absence of viewers. The marble corridors were no less beautiful when deserted. But without the revenue that viewers provided, the system supporting this beauty became unsustainable. The Vatican responded with a digital pivot, offering virtual tours, streaming papal events, soliciting donations online. These efforts generated some income, but nothing approaching what ticket sales had provided. The pandemic forced a reckoning with the question of what the palace is for, who it serves, how it can function in a world where assumptions about travel and tourism can be upended by events beyond anyone's control. As restrictions eased and visitors gradually returned, the fundamental question remained unresolved. The palace's survival depends on a delicate balance, enough tourism to generate revenue, not so much that the crowds destroy what they came to see, enough modernization to meet contemporary expectations for accessibility and safety, not so much that the historic character is compromised, enough staffing to maintain operations, not so much that labor costs consume all revenue, enough conservation to preserve the art, not so much that the expense becomes unsustainable. This balance is negotiated daily through countless small decisions, whether to repair a leaking roof now or defer it another season, whether to replace aging climate control units or patch them one more time, whether to hire additional guards or accept longer lines and visitor frustration, whether to raise ticket prices, generating more revenue but potentially reducing visitor numbers, or keep prices accessible, risking insufficient income. Each decision involves trade-offs, competing values, uncertain outcomes. The people who make these decisions are bureaucrats, administrators, conservators, not saints, not artists, not visionaries, but professionals trying to manage an impossible inheritance. They work in offices scattered through the palace, spaces that mix the functional and the sublime. A conservator might analyze paint samples in a laboratory equipped with electron microscopes, then walk down a corridor where Raphael's brushwork covers the walls. An accountant reviewing budget spreadsheets sits in a room with a view across gardens designed by Renaissance masters. This juxtaposition of the mundane and the magnificent defines the contemporary palace. It is not frozen in the past. It is not a museum piece preserved under glass. It is a working institution, messy and complicated, where beauty and bureaucracy coexist because they must. The palace has survived because it evolved, because it adapted to changing circumstances without losing its essential identity. When territorial revenues disappeared, it opened museums. When aristocratic patronage ended, it professionalized administration. When the world changed, it changed with it, reluctantly at times, partially always, but enough to endure. This survival was never guaranteed. There were moments when collapse seemed possible, when debts overwhelmed income, when crises threatened to shatter the institution. But each time, decisions were made, painful, imperfect, but sufficient, that allowed the palace to persist. Yet, survival is not the same as triumph. The palace endures. But at what cost? The thousands of workers whose labor built it, whose names are forgotten, whose bodies were broken by the work, they paid. The communities across Europe from which wealth flowed to Rome, funding construction while local needs went unmet, they paid. The millions of believers who bought indulgences, who donated coins they could not afford, who trusted that their money served sacred purposes, they paid. The artists who created beauty under conditions that damaged their health, who worked for patrons who wielded their power ruthlessly, they paid. The cost was distributed across space and time, across social classes and national boundaries, spread so widely that no single ledger could account for it, yet real nonetheless. The cost continues. The tourists who visit today pay entrance fees, certainly, but also opportunity costs, the chance to see other things, to be elsewhere, to spend their resources differently. The Italian state, which provides security, infrastructure, tax exemptions, pays. The global Catholic community, which contributes to Vatican finances through Peter's Pence and other donations, pays. The museum staff who work for modest wages in one of the world's most expensive cities pay. The neighboring residents who endure crowds and traffic pay. The cost ripples outward, touching everyone connected to the palace directly or indirectly. And there is another cost, harder to quantify but perhaps most significant: the cost of maintaining an institution built to project power and certainty in an age that increasingly values humility and questions. The tension between the palace's historical function to overwhelm, to inspire awe, to demonstrate the Church's supremacy, and contemporary ideals of simplicity, equality, accessibility. The discomfort many feel when encountering such concentrated wealth and beauty in a church theoretically committed to serving the poor. These contradictions are not new, but they have become more acute, harder to reconcile. The Vatican has tried to address these tensions, to present the palace not as a symbol of power, but as a custodian of human cultural achievement, art held in trust for all humanity. This framing is not dishonest, but it is incomplete. The palace was built to serve specific interests, to advance particular claims to authority. It may now function partly as a museum, may welcome visitors regardless of faith or nationality, but it remains the headquarters of a hierarchical institution, a place where power resides and decisions are made that affect millions. The beauty and the power cannot be separated. They were designed together, each reinforcing the other. So the question posed at the beginning remains: who paid for this dream, and what does it cost to keep it alive? The answer is complex, layered, unsatisfying in its refusal of simple conclusions. Everyone paid something. The laborers paid with their bodies. The faithful paid with their resources. The artists paid with their time and health. The communities paid with their wealth. The institution itself paid with its credibility, with the gap between its ideals and its practices, with the resentments that grew and eventually fractured Western Christianity. And the cost of maintaining it continues to accumulate. Money, certainly, tens of millions annually. Labor, thousands of people working daily. Compromises between conservation and access, between purity and pragmatism, between the past and the present. The palace endures because enough people across generations decided it was worth preserving, that the beauty justified the cost, that the art transcended the circumstances of its creation. This decision is made again every year, in budget meetings and conservation labs, in ticket booths and maintenance schedules. The palace teaches us that great beauty is never free, never self-sustaining, never above the grubby necessities of plumbing and electricity and payroll. It teaches us that magnificence requires infrastructure, that art depends on labor, that every masterpiece rests on foundations both literal and figurative. Stone and mortar, yes, but also social arrangements, economic systems, hierarchies of power and value. It teaches us that survival is not passive, not the natural state of things, but an achievement won through continuous effort, through adaptation and compromise. Above all, it teaches us that the distinction between the sacred and the profane, between the beautiful and the functional, between art and utility, is a fiction we maintain through willful blindness. The frescoes and the furnace room are parts of the same structure. The Sistine Chapel and the plumbing that prevents it from flooding are equally necessary. The genius of Michelangelo and the labor of the workers who carried his materials up scaffolding are both embedded in the ceiling we admire. The palace is not beautiful despite its infrastructure, but because of it, not transcendent of economic reality, but entirely dependent on it. The Vatican Apostolic Palace stands today, 5 centuries after its Renaissance reconstruction began, as a monument to human ambition and human labor, to artistic genius and administrative persistence, to the dreams of popes and the sweat of workers. It survived wars and plagues, political upheavals and financial crises, the Protestant Reformation and Italian unification, the collapse of aristocratic patronage, and the rise of mass tourism. It survived because it changed, because those responsible for it made choices that balanced preservation with adaptation, tradition with necessity. But survival alone is not meaning. The palace's significance lies not just in its endurance, but in what it reveals about the human capacity to create beauty and the costs that creation inevitably demands. It stands as testimony to the fact that the greatest achievements require sacrifice, that nothing magnificent emerges without someone paying a price, that beauty is not a gift but a purchase, made with resources drawn from somewhere, from someone. We can visit the palace, walk its corridors, admire its art. We can experience awe at Michelangelo's vision, wonder at Raphael's skill, amazement at the scale and ambition. But we should also remember the workers whose names we don't know, the believers whose coins funded construction, the communities whose wealth flowed to Rome, the systems of labor and finance and power that made this beauty possible. The palace invites admiration. It also demands recognition of what admiration alone cannot sustain. It asks us to see not just the facade, but the foundation, not just the art, but the apparatus, not just the dream, but the price of dreaming. When you stand before beauty that required sacrifice to create and demands ongoing cost to preserve, does your responsibility end with admiration? Or does awareness of the price create an obligation to those who paid it?